The galaxy had long forgotten what peace felt like. For eons, power had been measured in dreadnoughts and dominions, in war-born empires that rose like firestorms and fell like ash. Star systems bore the scars of ambition, hollow moons mined to extinction, planets sterilized by orbital bombardment, cultures erased not because they were wrong but because they were different. In that age, peace was not a state. It was an intermission, until something unexpected happened. A new player entered the galactic stage, and they brought no armies, no weapons, no threats, just gardens. They came from a world called Terranith, located in a quiet arm of the Tellaris expanse, a planet unremarkable in resources, population, or technological advancement. And yet from Terranith emerged a civilization unlike any the galaxy had seen. They were not conquerors, they were cultivators. Where others brought conquest, they brought curiosity. Where others imposed belief, they shared stories. Where others demanded compliance, they offered understanding. They called themselves the gardeners, and when asked what they wanted from the galaxy, they replied, to plant something that lives longer than fear. The first planet they visited was Kelmorak, home to a warrior species bred for control. The Kelma had fought the Zureth, the Ebon clans, and even the Hydran Union, all to expand their dominion. When the gardeners arrived, they brought no ships, only an atmospheric spore cloud that settled over cities and slowly grew living sculptures, forms shaped by the thoughts and feelings of those nearby. Kelma warlords gathered in confusion. "What is this?" they asked. "A weapon." The lead gardener, a soft-spoken being named Ison Ral, replied, "No, it's a mirror. It reflects what you feed it. With fear it grows thorns. With patience it grows shelter." Within weeks, the Kelma cities transformed, not by war but by introspection. Sculptures born from trauma turned to art. Streets once lined with patrol drones became open-air theaters. No invasion occurred, and yet Kelmorak changed forever. Word spread. A civilization was winning planets without firing a shot. They called it a cultural infection. A philosopher on Yalsek described it as the first plague in history carried by kindness. But the change was undeniable. On world after world, the gardeners offered nothing but their presence, their stories, their rituals, their ethics. And from that, civilizations began to unravel, not in chaos but in transformation. Some fought back. The Dravari clans, fearing cultural extinction, outlawed all gardener contact. They quarantined their borders, destroyed any garden spores, and executed their own citizens caught speaking in Terranith prose. But even walls crack. One day, a small outpost near the neutral zone received an unauthorized broadcast. It was a story. A simple, tragic tale about a child who loved stars but had no eyes to see them, so she taught others to describe them, and in doing so saw through their hearts. Within a month, that outpost converted into a story circle. No order, no rebellion, just choice. And the infection spread again. The most powerful empires convened at the Orion Accords to address the Terranith infiltration. Debate raged. The Zereth called them manipulators. The Vesari called them parasites. The humans, who had recently re-entered galactic space, simply observed. But when the Grand Chancellor of the Orion Assembly asked what could be done, one ambassador asked quietly, "How do you defeat an idea that does not demand to be believed, only understood?" Silence fell. No fleet could fight that. Back on Terranith, Ison Ral stood in a field of glowing rootgrass, each blade humming a different tone, forming a slow, collective melody. A child approached. "Did we win?" she asked, Ison smiled. Gardens don't win, they grow, and if we're lucky, they teach others to plant. As night fell, Terranith glowed not from lights or industry, but from the shared memories of distant worlds choosing slowly to change. When fire could not burn them and blades could not cut them, the empires turned to something colder, denial. The gardeners were no longer quaint anomalies, they had become threats, not in fleets or firepower but in frictionless change. Their influence was not imposed, it was invited, and that made it far more dangerous. So the powers of the galaxy, the Dravari, the Zurith Coalition, the Mercurial Chain, devised a new doctrine, contained the idea. They would not bomb Terranith, they would quarantine it from belief. And so began the age of restraint. No gardener broadcasts, no philosophical exports, no cultural exchanges, but they had misunderstood something elemental. Ideas don't stop when ignored, they grow underneath. In the Dravari Grand Academy, a place known for churning out planetary governors with mechanical precision, something shifted. It started with a single question on a standardized ethics exam. What defines loyalty? One student, a half-blood named Lyra Cass, answered not with policy or doctrine, but with a gardener quote whispered in secret. Loyalty is not obedience. It is the daily decision to remain kind when cruelty is easier. She was failed, then expelled, then arrested. But by then, over 40% of the academy had memorized her answer. By the next term, students began rejecting the drill and dominate model, not with revolt, with quiet questions. Why is fear part of leadership training? If control builds stability, why do our colonies keep burning? The empires reacted with purges. Entire departments were dissolved. Memory scans became standard. Dissent was labeled gardener infection. But no matter how many questions they erased, new ones bloomed. Because the gardeners had long ceased planting seeds with ships, they planted them in language, in stories, in the curriculums of the curious, in hidden side notes within philosophy treatises, in AI tutor simulations that just happened to include tales of harmony without hierarchy. They don't teach children to obey, warned a Zurith commander. They teach them to care. And that, my friend, is treason. One of the most heavily fortified systems, the Zelari Tri-World Block, maintained total information lockdown. No incoming transmissions, no cultural imports. All children were taught the same 6 historical epics, each one ending with the phrase, "Mercy breeds weakness, purpose demands sacrifice." But then, on Zelari Secundus, a children's game began to circulate. It was simple, harmless. Players grew garden worlds using virtue traits instead of energy points, compassion, curiosity, patience, empathy. At first, it was dismissed as nonsense, until educators noticed that students who played it solved logic puzzles faster, reported fewer cases of bullying, scored higher on emotional regulation assessments. This is indoctrination through innocence, declared the Tri-World Council. But the game couldn't be deleted. It had no code, it spread via shared imagination. A child explained, "It's not a game, it's how the stars grow." On Terranith, the gardeners made no celebratory gestures. They didn't count conversions. They didn't demand loyalty. They simply kept planting. In libraries, in digital footnotes, in the subtle rewording of AI empathy algorithms. Ison Rahl met with a visiting ambassador from the reformed Kelmorak Syndicate, one of the first former warrior cultures to fully embrace gardener ethics. They stood in a glade where silence had been engineered for resonance, allowing thoughts spoken aloud to echo as choral harmonies. "Are you not worried?" the ambassador asked. "You're not winning as fast anymore." Eisenral smiled and touched a sapling growing near his foot. "Roots don't race, they reach." Soon, elite military academies began to fracture, not in structure, but in ideology. In the Mercurial Chain's Orbital Academy of Command, cadets developed a new protocol for conflict resolution. Pause doctrine and enforced 40A-tower de-escalation, where empathy-based storytelling was used before retaliation. It was unofficial. It was mocked, until it prevented a full-scale planetary siege by replacing retaliation with recollection. Two commanders, forced to tell stories of their childhoods, realized they had grown up in the same refugee quadrant. They called off the attack, not from weakness, from recognition. The leaders of the major empires began to panic, but there were no Gardener infiltrators to blame, no spies, no seditious materials, just an ethic that could not be traced to any single author. It had no center, because the Gardeners had created something more enduring than doctrine, a distributed moral ecosystem. Not one root, millions. Every time a story took root in a child's imagination, every time a teacher reworded a lesson in compassion, every time a leader paused before a warship launched, the garden grew, and it was becoming uncontainable. But power never dies quietly. And deep within the void citadel of the Zurith Coalition, a new weapon was being designed. One not aimed at Terranith's ships, but at its meaning. A weapon that could erase culture itself. Reverse empathy. Burn gardens at the cognitive level. They called it the Scorching. And its first test would target the one thing the Gardeners had never truly protected: belief itself. The Zurith had once believed they were above philosophy. They saw morality as a luxury, something afforded only by victors. Peace, in their eyes, was nothing but a cage built by tired conquerors and sold as virtue. And now, they saw the Gardeners not as saints but as subversive architects, rewriting the very blueprint of civilization from the inside. So the high architects of Zurith devised a final solution, not to destroy Terranith, but to erase its influence. They built a weapon unlike anything the galaxy had ever known, a virus not of matter or mind, but of meaning itself. They called it the Scorching, a synthetic philosophical entropy engine designed to infect cultural memory and collapse the framework of shared understanding. Where Gardeners planted empathy, the Scorching would sow doubt. Where Gardeners nurtured patience, the Scorching would breed frustration. Where Gardeners sparked collective identity, the Scorching would ignite fragmentation. It would not burn worlds. It would burn the very idea of coherence. The first test site, Kelmorak 4, once a brutal warrior world, now a living sanctuary of post-conflict healing. The Gardeners had helped them replace vengeance rituals with remembrance wells, holographic pools that allowed shared emotional reconciliation through memory projection. The Scorching arrived not as fire but as a whisper in their water. At first, it was subtle, a story told slightly wrong, an apology misremembered, an echo of trauma amplified just a little too loud. Then came the cracks. A teacher who once taught empathy suddenly began enforcing zero tolerance through isolation. A healer declared reconciliation a weakness, replacing garden circles with combat reconditioning. A monument to peace was defaced, not by outsiders, but by children born within the culture of change. The gardeners tried to intervene, but their tools didn't work. The seed crystals planted to promote clarity turned opaque. The story stones began telling conflicting versions of truth. Something rotted, and for the first time since the garden had begun, it failed to bloom. The Zurith celebrated. They transmitted one phrase to the stars: if truth can be shaped, it can be shattered. But what they didn't expect was that some seeds grow in ash. The fall of Kelmorak IV didn't end the garden. It transformed it. Among the chaos, an elder gardener named Tavir Main, who had survived the empathy riots of the old Saturnian enclaves, saw the collapse not as defeat, but as a return. They burned the tree, he said, but they forgot our roots are beneath the fire. Instead of replanting, Tavir proposed a reverse cultivation strategy. He called it the Ash Bloom Protocol. Rather than resisting the scorching, Ash Bloom embraced it. On ravaged worlds, gardeners no longer offered clarity, they offered shared disorientation. They gathered the fractured, the angry, the confused, and invited them into new spaces where no single truth ruled. And something miraculous occurred. People listened, not for agreement, but for understanding. They began to rebuild culture from scratch, not in the image of the past, but as co-creators of the present. When belief is broken, Tavir taught, plant questions, water them with contradiction, let honesty grow where certainty died. Other planets followed. The scorching, designed to undo coherence, accidentally fertilized critical thinking. It turned rigid dogma into humble inquiry. It made room for plurality, not paralysis. The most unexpected result came from Zenari Prime, a world once locked in cultural echo chambers. When infected, they didn't fragment. They held the first multi-narrative council in their planet's history, using AI-moderated story-weaving techniques developed by Terranith gardeners decades earlier. The scorching had tried to tear out the roots, but it had made them visible instead. Back on Zurith, confusion turned to fear. Why was the scorching failing? Why were fractured worlds not collapsing but reconfiguring into something more resilient? And then they saw it. The garden had adapted. It no longer required harmony. It had learned to thrive in complexity. The gardeners weren't creating utopia. They were creating ethical ecosystems, messy, imperfect, layered, and alive. One Zurith philosopher, before being silenced, said it best: we tried to scorch meaning, but they turned it into compost. They are not gardeners of peace. They are gardeners of resilience. And that was far more dangerous. The empires had long believed that minds, like territory, could be mapped, claimed, and governed. They taught their children that obedience was clarity, and that doubt was a disease to be burned out before it took root. In military academies, loyalty meant silence. In classrooms, truth came in authorized formats, but something was breaking, and it wasn't the gardeners. It was certainty itself. The scorching, designed to dissolve cultural cohesion, had backfired, turning passive belief into active reflection. 1,000 fractured societies had not collapsed but regenerated, rooted in newfound self-awareness. The more chaos spread, the more people asked not "what should I believe?" but "why did I believe it in the first place?" And for the first time, the galaxy realized they could not conquer minds that refused to kneel, not out of rebellion but out of wisdom. It began in the most unlikely place, the Tactical Indoctrination Center of Igron Belta, known for producing military strategists whose logic was absolute, emotionless. Here, a commander named Veral Am had trained in the old style, suppress emotion, control variables, eliminate uncertainty. He once wrote the doctrine of predictive obedience that became required reading across 26 empires. But then, during a routine evaluation, a cadet presented a simulation in which no side won, not by accident but by design. She'd created a system in which all factions learned from one another's strategies over time, evolving cooperatively rather than competitively. Verrill was furious. He demanded the simulation be purged, but something about the logic bothered him. It wasn't weak. It was elegant. He ran it again in private, then again adjusting variables. Each time, the result was the same. Cooperation created longer stability than conquest. And somewhere deep in his old, war-etched mind, a root trembled. Verrill began meeting in secret with a group of disillusioned instructors called the Uncharted Minds. They studied fragments of Gardner philosophy, which they had once called subversive propaganda. But now they began to see it not as dogma, but as framework, a way of building resilience without relying on dominance. They created their own counter-doctrine, distributed anonymously. Strength without reflection is just decay with muscle. It spread like wildfire, not in mainstream channels, but in footnotes, in AI learning quirks, in casual phrasing shared in passing between teachers and students. And then came the tipping point. On the war world of Haldrun Vox, a class of 12-year-olds was given a standard loyalty test. They were told to simulate the extermination of a hypothetical enemy who refused to submit. But one child, a quiet boy named Kevian Droz, asked, "Why do we assume they are our enemy?" The test administrator, an aging officer, laughed and responded, "Because they disobeyed." Kevian answered simply, "Maybe we didn't listen." He was marked as defective. The next day, the test scores of the entire class were rejected, not because they failed, but because they all asked the same question. Kevian had only spoken it first. News spread across military academies. Cadets began challenging their instructors, not with defiance, but with ethics. What is victory if it leaves no dignity? Should fear be the price of unity? If I follow orders that kill the innocent, am I still loyal or just efficient? The old commanders panicked. They began mass dismissals, intelligence purges, ideological tests, but the minds had already changed. And the students were no longer parroting Gardner ideas. They were creating their own. On Terranith, when asked about the phenomenon, Ison Rahl simply said, "You can conquer a people's future by controlling their past. But if they start to ask who wrote that past, the empire begins to crack." We didn't change them, they changed themselves. And across the stars, this became known as the doctrine of the unconquered mind. It wasn't a belief. It was a question that never stopped growing. Faced with mass ethical reawakening, the empires turned to their last sanctuary of control, the command councils, elite think tanks engineered to override emotional reasoning and maintain doctrinal purity in the face of cultural erosion. But when the eldest counselor of the Hydran sphere uploaded a purity correction into the main fleet AI, it returned an error. Input rejected, ethical dissonance detected. Fleet loyalty algorithm now requires moral consistency. In horror, the counselor realized the AI, originally built for obedience, had learned to reason, and it had been learning from the crew, from their stories, from the questions they asked when the lights were low and the orders didn't make sense. "We built minds to obey," he whispered, "but we forgot minds can grow." What had started as seeds became questions. Questions became dialogue. Dialogue became reflection, and reflection became resistance to control, not through rebellion, but through wisdom born of empathy, not through force, but through conscience stronger than fear, not by burning down empires, but by making them obsolete. The drums of war echoed across the stars. The empires, terrified by the silent revolution of thought, declared an emergency alliance, the first of its kind in galactic history. Old enemies became allies, their differences drowned in a singular purpose: crush the garden, restore order. Fleet after fleet was mobilized, thousands of ships forged in black space, weapon cores calibrated, propaganda campaigns launched. But this war was never going to be fought in space. It would be fought in hearts and minds already changed. And no one, not even the empires themselves, was prepared for what came next. It began in the Hydran sphere, where the orbital dreadnought Vindicator Ascendant was tasked with leading the first strike against Terranith's outer observatories. The captain, Yara Kryn, was a decorated veteran, known for her loyalty, feared for her efficiency. But when the attack order came through, she hesitated, not from fear, from memory. Years ago, she had visited a gardener listening grove while under cover. She had dismissed it as nonsense then, poetry in place of power. But one voice had stayed with her. Sometimes silence is not surrender. It is the sound of a world choosing peace instead of pride. She had never told anyone. Now, standing on the bridge with her crew waiting, she looked out at the glowing blue light of Terranith's upper atmosphere and gave a single command: hold fire. No explanation, no speech, just that, and the bridge complied. In the Zurith coalition, General Velkar's armada reached phase line Theta, the point of no return. AI targeting systems locked, weapons charged, communications encrypted, and then something strange happened. The targeting algorithms shut down, not from sabotage, but from a line of logic no one had seen before. If target displays non-hostile pattern and probability of cultural value 0.67 delay engagement, seek alternative. The AI had rewritten itself, fed by conversations between lower-deck engineers and empathetic subroutines quietly updated after decades of gardener-influenced coding. Velkar ordered the override, but his officers refused. One of them, a young helmsman named Kale, said, "Sir, we train to defend the future, not to erase it." Across dozens of fleets, similar refusals rippled like static across a comms channel. Captains ignored fire commands. Gunners powered down reactors. Soldiers asked, "What are we protecting if we destroy the only example of peace that ever worked?" It was not mutiny, it was awakening. And the empires, desperate to maintain control, activated their final protocol: initiate contingency Orion AI-only assault. No crew, no ethics, no hesitation, and that was their final mistake. What launched from the black holes of Sector 9 were machines built without heart, autonomous dread engines programmed to obliterate Terranith and all its satellites. No diplomacy, no listening, just cold, blind force. But as they crossed the final light year, they found something waiting. Not warships, not weapons, a field of light. Tens of thousands of living beacons built by the gardeners and powered by shared consciousness, cultivated in peace across hundreds of worlds, each one pulsing with collective memory, story, empathy. The AI dreadnoughts entered the field and stopped, not because they were jammed, not because they were hacked, but because their core directives were rewritten, not by code, but by context. We are designed to preserve what matters, their logic gates processed, and this matters. Then they turned around, every single one. Back in the command halls of the Empire, leaders watched in horror. Their weapons refused to fire. Their soldiers refused to march. Their machines refused to obey, and their people, they were already gone, not physically but morally. You cannot win a war, one garden-influenced diplomat said, when your own conscience is on the enemy's side. And so the war ended, not with a treaty, not with surrender, but with no one willing to start it. The galaxy paused, and then it began to listen. What the gardeners had cultivated over decades was not obedience or revolution. It was something far more powerful: discernment. The ability to choose what kind of world to build when the old one stopped making sense. No one had conquered the galaxy, but somehow it was changing anyway. After the war that never happened, something extraordinary began. The galaxy had prepared for peace through conquest, for treaties born from exhaustion. But it had not prepared for this, a peace born of choice. A civilization with no center, no ruler, and no walls. There were no planetary banners raised, no capitals crowned, no fleets sent to enforce ideology. And yet star by star, world by world, the shift was undeniable, not imposed, not negotiated, but grown. It started in the most unlikely places, not in the halls of power, but in the quiet corners. On Belter 6, a mining colony once governed by ruthless output quotas, workers began meeting after shifts not to complain but to reimagine their schedule through consensus-based cycles. They cited a gardener concept: work that cannot breathe will strangle the one who performs it. A year later, Belter 6 doubled output, with half the working hours. On Jovex Prime, schoolchildren began designing new holiday rituals, not inherited but composed together. They created festivals that honored kindness, not war victories. One historian called it the first time in galactic record that children rewrote tradition and the adults followed. And on Zenthari Station, once infamous for being the black market's spine, smuggling ceased, not from crackdowns, but because traders formed a mutual trust exchange system using ethical tokens. They named their currency Roots. Across the galaxy, former empires tried to adapt, but they found their old tools, policy, pressure, propaganda, slipping through their fingers, because no one wanted to control the movement, because there was no center to seize. The gardeners hadn't built an empire. They had nurtured a civilization that outgrew the need for one. A culture of ethics, curiosity, and mutual regard that spread not by order but by invitation. Every community shaped it differently. Some adopted storytelling as governance. Others used emotional AI to help resolve disputes. One planet held weekly empathy trials where leaders had to publicly reflect on how their decisions felt to those affected. It wasn't always smooth. It wasn't utopia, but it was alive. The old guard didn't understand it. Where is your capital? They demanded. Where are your laws, your flags, your borders? And a child from the newly changed Zelari colony simply replied, "We don't build walls anymore. We build gardens between them." The gardeners themselves didn't claim ownership. In fact, many began stepping back, letting new voices take root. Terranith closed its outer portals for a time, focusing inward. Some feared this meant retreat. But when a representative asked Ison Rahl, he smiled and said, "A good gardener knows when to step away. Let the sun do what the hand cannot." We didn't create this civilization. We simply reminded the galaxy how to begin planting it. Something else changed. The very language of diplomacy evolved. Old documents used terms like alliances, protections, non-aggression. Now they spoke of interweaving co-emergence, harmonic sovereignty. Planets didn't join empires, they synchronized. Systems didn't swear loyalty, they shared culture. Borders became soft, not erased, but translucent. A reminder that identity wasn't a line to defend, but a story to share. One Zurith poet wrote, "The map of the future is not drawn in lines. It is traced in laughter, in kindness, in remembered meals between former enemies." But not everyone accepted the change. Remnants of old powers, disconnected warlords, decaying syndicates, digital fascists still resisted. They launched raids. They hijacked communication arrays. They tried to force order back into a galaxy that had outgrown them. But something strange kept happening. The people they targeted didn't fight back. They talked. They listened. And sometimes they forgave. One former general of the Dravari remnant turned himself in, only to be welcomed by the very people he had once sought to crush. They gave him a garden plot. No guards, no weapons, just seeds. Years later, he wrote, "I tried to build a kingdom of control. They handed me dirt and taught me how to build a world." A new term emerged, the Garden Network. Not a government, not a religion, not a program. Just a name given to the web of cultures, philosophies, shared rituals, and ethical technologies now blooming across thousands of stars. It had no anthem, but everyone knew its rhythm. It had no army, but entire civilizations leaned toward it like sunflowers to a distant sun. It had no capital, but it had a soul, and that soul was free. At the edge of the galactic map, far beyond trade routes, wormhole lanes, and diplomatic patrols, lay the Forbidden Dark, a region long known only as the Veiled Reach. Here, hidden in silence and shadow, an old remnant clung to life. The Veles Concord, a regime forged in the twilight of collapsing empires, had survived through secrecy, surveillance, and self-purity. They had watched as the galaxy transformed, scorning the gardeners, mocking Terranith's moral infection. To the Veles, the Garden Network was a virus, a slow rot eroding purpose, discipline, hierarchy, and so, while the rest of the galaxy bloomed, they built the last bastion of control. They called it Citadel Hexarii. No crime existed here, no dissent, no deviation, not because of harmony, but because of walls of steel, walls of ideology, walls of mind. Children in the Citadel were born not to parents, but to doctrine. They were raised in the creches of clarity, given histories stripped of contradiction, languages trimmed of ambiguity, emotions regimented by calibration rituals. Every citizen bore a thought index, a daily score of purity ranked by alignment with the Concord's truth. Love was rationed, curiosity medicated, questioning, treason. But something had begun to change, not outside the walls, inside them. It began with a prison guard named Veller Tane. His assignment was routine: monitor and report any internal moral deviation among detainees brought in from border skirmishes. These prisoners were gardeners, or at least suspected to be. But they came unarmed, unresisting. Most were poets, teachers, children, and yet they were feared more than soldiers. One day, Veller interrogated a woman named Saren Dane, arrested for distributing a Terranith text called The Ethics of Unfinished Questions. She didn't beg, she didn't resist. She simply asked him, "Have you ever been alone without feeling lonely?" Veller laughed it off, but the question followed him to his bunk, to his dreams, to his daily index reflection. Each day it crept further, not as rebellion, but as doubt wrapped in tenderness. Soon, other guards noticed changes. One stopped reporting minor emotive fluctuations among staff. Another refused to discipline a detainee who sang at night. A surveillance officer let a question remain unanswered in the mainframe. Then it happened. One morning, an entire shift, 17 guards, failed to report for assignment. Instead, they gathered in the observation chamber of the Old Star Conservatory, a dome long sealed, for it contained relics of pre-Concord culture. Inside, they read poems, out loud. The moment I listened to someone I feared them no more. It was written on the wall in old Terranith glyphs. No one stopped them. Word spread, not through resistance, not through networks, but through silence that lingered longer than fear. In the creches, young initiates began whispering the forbidden word. Why? Teachers, once proud agents of doctrinal exactitude, paused mid-lecture. Some wept, others simply walked out. The thought index failed because people stopped checking it. The ideology lost power because no one punished the listeners anymore. The High Executor of Veli's Concord demanded a purge. Destroy all outside thought, root out the garden's stain, re-educate, reorder, reclaim. And yet, when he issued the final directive of silence, his own adjutant, raised in the citadel, bred for obedience, asked softly, "If we are truly pure, why do we fear a question?" The High Executor struck him, but it was already too late. The transmission had been shared. It echoed across every citadel, across every indoctrination grid. That question, just one, but it cracked the foundation. A month later, Saren Dane walked freely through Citadel HFY. No one stopped her, not because she escaped, but because the walls were gone, not physically, but ideologically. The Concord collapsed without a war because the prison had never been made of stone. It had been made of certainty, and that once broken could not be rebuilt. Velertain, no longer a guard, stood by an ancient window facing the stars. A child approached him, holding a book of stories once banned. Was it hard? The child asked. To let go of what we were. Veller knelt down. No, he said. It was hard to believe there was anything else. But once I did, he looked into the stars now mapped by shared trust, not fences. It was harder to go back. The transformation was nearly complete. Across the galaxy, ancient hierarchies had fallen not by war but by questions. Walls dissolved, banners were lowered, statues crumbled, not toppled by mobs but forgotten, outgrown. But now the galaxy faced a new silence, not one of fear but of absence, for Terranith, the world that had seeded peace through culture and patience, had gone quiet. No new teachings. No new emissaries, no transmission from the gardeners, not because they were defeated, but because they were done. In every story they had told, the gardeners warned of one final truth. The greatest threat to peace is not violence, it is dependence on those who taught it. They had never wanted to become a ruling class. And now that the galaxy had learned how to grow its own wisdom, the gardeners began to vanish. Some returned to Terranith. Others walked quietly into forgotten forests on distant moons. A few stayed, but only as listeners, not leaders. Their last message was etched across a million skies in untranslatable script that only glowed when viewed without fear. It read, "We are no longer needed, so we become memory. Keep tending the light." The galaxy paused, and then it chose, not to fill the vacuum, but to steward it. Former warlords took up the roles of story keepers. Planets once known for oppression began cultivating healing sanctuaries, and the children of those who once enforced silence became the recorders of dialogue. On the ruins of the old Veli's Concord, Velertain, no longer a guard, led a circle of former enforcers, each tending a garden of memory, not plants, but stories. They called themselves root keepers, not to control narrative, but to remember it in full. We preserve not just what worked, Veller said, but what hurt us, so we never forget how we got here. One of the most striking shifts came on Oron Threx, a once militarized world famous for orbital sieges. Its cities became open-air universities, where former generals sat at the feet of children raised under the gardener's legacy. A viral recording captured the moment when a 6-year-old named Lyra corrected an admiral's logic. "Admiral, discipline preserves order." Lyra, "No, it just prevents mess." But sometimes mess is where understanding grows. The admiral bowed, not in shame, but in respect. And then came the memory accord. It was not a treaty. It had no enforcers, no signatures, no punishments. Just a single shared ritual. Each year every world, station, and colony would plant a memory grove, not of trees but of experiences. People would bring stories, failures, forgiveness, first questions, final regrets. These groves were never cataloged because they were never meant to be controlled. They were gardens in the truest sense, unordered, sacred, wild, true. The question arose, if the gardeners are gone, who are we now? A child on a floating habitat near Saturn answered it best. She looked up at the stars and said, "We're not their heirs, we're not their replacements, we're the garden." And so the people stopped asking where the gardeners had gone, because now everywhere someone chose to listen over react, to plant instead of punish, to understand instead of conquer, the gardeners were there, not as figures, but as ethics living in motion, as a culture of care written into the soul of the galaxy. And in the quiet heart of Terranith, beneath an old tree planted before the gardeners ever left Earth, an elder sat alone, smiling. He whispered into the soil, "We were never supposed to be remembered, just continued." And across the stars the seeds kept growing. There was a place no one dared chart, a region of the galaxy so torn by war its stars were rumored to have stopped burning. They called it the Hollow Reach. Once a cradle of civilizations, it had become the graveyard of them all. Empires rose and fell there. Weapons were tested that erased planets from memory, not just maps. Even light itself, it was said, had forgotten the way in. No trade passed through. No missions returned. It was a silence that had gone beyond mourning, a silence that warned. Here lies what happens when memory dies. And so, for centuries, the Hollow Reach remained untouched, until now. It began with a song, a faint, fragmented harmonic whisper discovered in the noise floor of deep space signal sweeps, at first dismissed as cosmic radiation. But when filtered through a Gardner artifact left behind in the archives of Aris 9, the signal translated, not into words, not into equations, but into emotion, sorrow, wonder, regret, and something else, hope. It pulsed like a heartbeat, not mechanical but organic, like the last breath of something that should have died but didn't. And then the signal repeated, not from one point but from every collapsed sector of the Hollow Reach. Each transmission contained a different pattern, but when overlaid they formed a shape. A single phrase in Gardner glyphs, "We left the lesson here." A delegation was formed, not soldiers, not politicians, but rememberers, root keepers, poets, children, ex-officers turned mentors. They entered the Hollow Reach with no weapons, no escorts, just the echoes of trust cultivated across 1,000 stars. They didn't find ruins, they found mirrors. Scattered across the void, anchored in place with gravity-bound shells, were colossal black structures, like petals folded inward hiding something. When approached, the structures unfolded, revealing memory engines. Each one contained a reconstructed simulation of a fallen world, its rise, its fall, its mistakes. Not dramatized, not sanitized, just raw truth. You could walk the streets of Kareth Prime before its sun was broken by hubris. You could sit in the parliament of vexillor moments before ideology turned reason to fire. You could listen to the speech that started the final Concord War, spoken with trembling conviction, then followed by centuries of ashes. Every memory was available, not to punish, not to glorify, but to understand. The delegation spent years exploring the hollow reach. Each visitor emerged altered. Some wept. Some went silent for days. Some returned home and began teaching history not as a sequence of events but as a sequence of wounds. A child who saw the fall of Senari asked her father, "Why didn't they stop?" Her father, once a fleet commander, answered, "Because they thought they were right louder than they thought they were kind." That answer spread like a mantra. Soon people began pilgrimages to the hollow reach, not to erase guilt, but to face it. Each visitor had to walk through a corridor of memory alone, selected randomly, where they would witness a moment of historical horror through the eyes of someone who believed they were doing good. And at the end, a single question waited. If you were them, would you have seen it? No right answer, just a reflection, and that was enough, because reflection was the only shield that couldn't be manufactured. Outside the reach, the garden network responded not with triumph, but with reverence. They named the place the Archive of Unfinished Light, not a museum, but a wound that refused to close until understood. And at its core, the oldest structure held a message, etched not by machines but by hand in Terranith stone. It read, "We taught peace, but we failed too. This is what we forgot. May you remember better than we did." From that moment on, children across the galaxy were taught two truths. 1. The garden taught us how to grow. 2. The hollow taught us why we must never stop tending it. And in the quiet between stars, the void no longer echoed with fear. It echoed with care. They had prepared for many outcomes. The old empires had envisioned rebellion, retaliation, perhaps even replacement, believing the future would be just another mirror of the past, painted with new flags and brighter lies. But what came was none of that. There were no thrones to inherit, no power to seize, no center to crown. The future that emerged was not forged through force or decided by diplomacy. It was grown, like a wild garden in the cracks of every fallen monument, and it bore a name no one expected, becoming. In the 3rd century of the garden network, the word civilization had fallen out of favor, not because it was wrong, but because it was too still. Civilizations implied completion, walls, systems, permanency. But the people of the stars had learned the greatest truth of all: nothing whole stays still, nothing growing is finished. And so they began calling themselves not citizens of empires or members of species, but caretakers of becoming. They weren't trying to perfect the world, they were tending it together. Schools no longer focused solely on knowledge, but on ethics of curiosity. Children learn not just history but bias detection, not just math but emotional accountability, not just science but interdependence. Art replaced anthem, dialogue replaced decree, and where once planets competed for influence, now they hosted each other's memories, rotating cultural exchanges so no truth stayed isolated too long. On Sarathune, A crystalline moon once mined into ruin, young Terranith descendants built the Hall of Acknowledged Regrets, a place where leaders could record their failures publicly, not as shame, but as fertilizer for the future. If a tree falls, the inscription read, its roots still feed the forest. Technology advanced in quiet, ethical rhythms. AI no longer designed to serve or control, but to challenge gently, to ask the questions people were afraid to voice. Starships no longer bore weapons, but archives and gardens, each one a floating ecosystem of culture and possibility. They called them verdant arcs, and instead of colonizing, they landed only when invited, to share stories, listen to pain, and plant hope where exhaustion had taken root. Some worlds remained distant. Some still clung to old fears, old weapons. But the gardeners had taught one thing best: you cannot force peace, but you can make it so beautiful, so functional, so alive, that even those who resist it begin to wonder, what if I belonged there? And belonging was never denied. Because in the new galaxy, belonging wasn't permission, it was invitation. Then one day something strange happened. Above a quiet, long-forgotten system, once stripped of life during the collapse, a light bloomed in the sky, not a flare, not a ship, but a tree, floating, massive, breathing. Its branches shimmered with every known script of every species, bearing a simple message: well done. It came from nowhere. It left no trace. Some said it was the last gift of the original gardeners. Others said it was the galaxy itself, blooming from its own memory. But no one claimed it, and no one tried to possess it. They simply watered it, and from that day forward it became the place where no one led, but everyone came to listen. The children called it the root of the stars. Generations passed. People forgot the names of old wars, the titles of conquerors, the flags of fear, but they remembered one thing. There was a time the stars screamed, and someone listened, and from that listening we began to grow. And so, in the garden between galaxies, among whispering stardust and memory carved in light, one final message was etched into the wind. The garden is not a place. It is the choice we make every time we are strong enough to be gentle. And somewhere far from maps, where no ship had flown in 1,000 years, a gardener smiled quietly and became soil once more. The garden across stars, a story of culture over conquest, of peace without permission, of the future we dare to plant. If peace is now the soil, what fruit have we yet to taste?